is what I've written here clearly visible on the back? I think most of the audience were there at the school yesterday and day before. And by now you all know the importance of sparse sets. Neil Dara told us yesterday that they are important for hardness of modernization, for example. So I want to motivate sparse sets and instead just get on with proving these 4 results today. I want to show you 4 nice proofs. First one is start polynomial times disjunctive truth table reduces to sparse. Then NP equals RP. The second result is that if, again under the same assumption, if start disjunctive truth table reduces to sparse, then the polynomial hierarchy collapses to e to the NP. Then the third result is a strengthening of the Karp-Whiston theorem that I told you about. If start is in P by poly, that is if NP is contained and if NP has polynomial size circuits, then the polynomial hierarchy collapses ZTP to the NP. I will define all the terms for you in a minute. I am treating this more as an extension of the school that we had in the last 2 days and not as a formal conference talk. Yeah, okay. For kind of comparison, we can equivalently say start doing the reducible to sparse implies that because these two we know are equal. And the last one is that if start majority reduces to sparse, then actually both these consequences follow, but I'll only talk about this. So I want to tell you proofs of all 4 things. That is my objective. I think these are interesting because it's interesting it's a challenging open problem to show that you can get NP equals P as a consequence. Just like you could in the case of many one reductions and conjunctive truth table reductions. I think it should be possible to prove NP equals P. The problem has been open for quite some time now. Even in this case, both these consequences follow. And even here, one should be able to prove P equals NP as a consequence. Those are the interesting open problems that fall out of this. That's one reason why I'm giving this talk. I'm reviving reductions to sparse sets. All these results are many years old. So you can see how ancient the subject is. This is 1996. This is 93. This is maybe 98 or so, or 97 probably. And okay. So this one is a little recent. It's 2010. And this is also 1996. So many of the results are nearly 15 to 20 years old. But area is kind of fallen by the wayside and I'm on a revivalist agenda. So what is disjunctive truth table reduction? So let's just explain what this assumption means. Start polynomial times disjunctive truth table reduces to sparse set S. We know what sparse means. The number of strings in S at every length or up to length n is bounded by a polynomial. Start disjunctive truth table reduces to a sparse set S means that there is a polynomial time computable function f is poly time, and given as input a formula f, it produces a list of queries for the sparse set. Because it's polynomial time, there are polynomially many queries, all polynomial sites, and with the property that n is satisfiable, if and only if there exists I such that Qi is this. It's an OR of the memberships. Okay. So now let me get on with the first result. So notice that it suffices to prove that if F has at most one satisfying, has a unique satisfying assignment, suppose F has a unique satisfying assignment. Then under the assumption we can find it in polynomial. That's sufficient because we already know that from the Valiant-Vazirani lemma, which we discussed 2 days back in more than one lecture, that SAT randomly reduces to unique SAT. So given a formula F which is satisfiable, given a formula F, in randomized polynomial time we can construct another formula from it, such that if the original formula is satisfiable, this is going to have a unique satisfying assignment with probability something like 1 by order the size of the formula. And if F is not satisfiable, this is not going to be satisfiable. Okay. So just to recall it quickly, so the reduction has the following property. From F, you will randomly transform it to a new formula F prime with the property that F SAT in SAT implies F prime has a unique solution, unique satisfying assignment. And if F is not satisfiable, then of course F prime is not going to be satisfiable. So not only that, from the unique satisfying assignment of F prime, you can easily recover. In fact, some of the variables will give you the variables of F, and they will give you back a satisfying assignment for it. Because F prime contains an isolated satisfying assignment of it by the Valiant-Vazirani. So here what I am assuming is that I am given a formula F prime, and I want to find the unique satisfying assignment of F prime using the assumption, using this reduction function F. So this result is by Sai and Sivakumar. Which I am going to describe now. So the idea is you define this new language L, which looks as follows. Let me write F, where F is going to be the output of this randomized reduction. U and V are going to be elements from a suitably chosen finite field of size. It's an extension field of F2 of size 2 power L, and 2 power L is going to be polynomially bounded. It's going to be polynomial in the input size. So L is therefore going to be something logarithmic. What is the property when does the triple F UV belong to L? It is when there exists an assignment A bar in 0, 1 to n. I'm assuming that F has n Boolean variables x1 and x2, such that F of A bar is 1, it's a satisfying assignment. And now the other important conceptual kind of leap is that you're going to think of a satisfying assignment as a polynomial. Okay, how do you think of a string as a polynomial? So A bar looks like it's a Boolean string. So let's write it as A0, A1, An minus 1. So let's define the polynomial A bar x as summation Ai x power I. We're going to think of Boolean satisfying assignment as a polynomial with coefficients coming from the base field F2, but you can evaluate it in the extension field. And the condition that we're going to write down here is that when A bar is evaluated at U, you get a value. So such are the triples that are going to belong to the language L, F, U, V, such that F has a satisfying assignment which when interpreted as a polynomial and evaluated at the point U of the finite field F2 to the L gives you the value D. Okay. Clearly this language is an NP. Why is this an NP? I am assuming here that we are also given a description of the finite field F sub 2 to the L. How to describe the finite field? You need an irreducible polynomial of degree L. Let's assume that's also given as part of the input. You can even find it because it's only logarithmic degree. But you can assume that that finite field is also given as part of the input. I'm not writing it there. And the language is an NP because you guess the satisfying assignment, check that it is a satisfying assignment for F, and then interpret it as a polynomial, evaluate it at the point U. We know how to do finite field arithmetic in polynomial time. Check that the value that you get is D. So this is clearly NP. Everything else except the guessing of the satisfying assignment is polynomial time. Therefore, by the assumption, L is also disjunctive to table reducible to S. Because L is an NP. SAT is, so L is reducible to SAT because SAT is NP complete and combined with the reduction that is given from SAT to S. Let's assume this reduction is L. From L to S. Okay. So what is the formula that we should plug into the reduction in order to compute the satisfying assignment? Our aim is to plug in this formula F prime, which is output by the Rayleigh-Verzanani reduction. Why? Because I know that is going to have this high probability unique satisfying assignment. K-type was satisfiable, the original F instance of SAT, otherwise it's not going to be satisfiable. So let's say that you start with the formula FUV. F is the output of the reduction, and you're going to get a list of queries. 2, 1, 2, 2, 2. So, how large are these queries? They're all polynomially bounded, right? So I know that I'm only interested in the sparse set S up to some polynomial bound in the input. N is, let's say, or let me say, size of it. I'm only interested in the sparse set up to some polynomial bound in the size of N. And what do I know? So let me draw a little ball here to denote this slice of the sparse set. So what I know is that at least one of these queries is going to lie inside this ball for every choice of U and V. So I fix the formula F and I'm going to run over all possible U's and V's. How many elements do I run over therefore? 2 to the power 2L choices of U and V. As I run over the different choices of U and V, I get so these queries depend on U and V. I can put it as put U and V on top. So for every choice of U and V, I get a list of queries, and if F was satisfiable, then at least one of these queries is going to lie inside this sparse set. Of course, I don't know what the sparse set is, but let me collect all these lists of queries as I run over the different choices of U and V. I apply the reduction function F to the triple FUV, and I get these lists of queries. And I know that from each list, at least one element is going to be from the sparse set. So which are the candidate strings that I see from these different lists that are likely to be in the sparse set? The sparse set is small. I have 2 to the power 2l choices. So there should be many UVs which query the same, have the same query in their list, because the total number of elements here is bounded by some polynomial, some q of p of f. And if I choose my L suitably large, so that 2 to the 2l is sufficiently larger than this, then there should be some, for every UV I know that one of these things is going to be inside the sparse set, assuming n is satisfied.
For every u, you know that one p that is not.
For every u, very good, yeah. So we are going to be like this throughout the lecture. I expect people here to alert me and shine and go wrong. For every u, we know there's exactly, or there's at least one v, because we don't know whether f has a unique satisfying assignment. If f had a unique satisfying assignment, for every u there's going to be a unique v, okay? Such that for that v, one of these queries is going to be inside the sparse set. But the total number of u's that I am running through, there are 2 to the power l u's that I am running through. So let me draw a picture like this. So there are these u's and the corresponding v's. So u1 v1, u2 v2, u r vr, which are going to be querying the same string. What do? I get a system of linear equations, right? Whenever I see a string that is very popular, I write down a system of linear equations. A u1 equals v1, a u2 equals v2, a ur equals vr. These are linear equations and the coefficients a0 to a minus 1, these are the unknowns, right? And so the system of linear equations actually looks like a0 to a minus 1, 1 square, 1 a minus 1, 1 un, ur, sorry. That would need, I need only n of them, so I'll take any n of them. Equals the corresponding units. How many solutions does this system of linear equations have? The matrix is invertible because all the UIs are different. Its determinant is non-vanishing. It's a Vandermonde matrix. So there's a unique solution that I take. So I compute the unique solution and check that the AIs give me a satisfying assignment or not. I just need to make sure that my L is such that 2 power L is, by pigeonholing, 2 power L is more than n times the number of strings in the slice of the sparse set into which everything is mapping. Then I know that there must be something in the sparse set which is popular enough that I can write down n equations for it. There may be some spurious things which are not in the sparse set, which will not give me a satisfying assignment. It might also happen that if f does not have a unique satisfying assignment, then these equations correspond to different a's, and even then also what I reconstruct will not be a solution. But if f prime is the output of the Weyl-Vazirani reduction, and with the probability that is promised by the Weyl-Vazirani reduction, f prime then has a unique satisfying assignment, then I will be able to reconstruct it. And I try different popular points from the list of strings that are produced by the reduction. That concludes the proof of first thing. Okay. So what was the probability with which f prime produced a unique satisfying assignment? Something like at least 1 by 4 times the size of, or 1 by 8 times the size of it. Doesn't matter what it is. So this algorithm is going to produce, it is going to reconstruct that with probability inverse polynomial. If f is unsatisfiable, of course it never goes wrong. All we need to do to boost the success probability to get a randomized algorithm with success probability say 1 by half, this will repeat this several times. And if f was satisfactory, you will find it. So that concludes my first one. Now let's move on to the second.
So this is for unique SAT. So giving aside Rayleigh Kozierani, so you've shown that if unique SAT, if let's say SAT disjunctive truth table reduces sparse, unique SAT is in B. Actually, unique SAT is in B.
No, we don't know that. See, what might happen is that some formulas which don't have a unique satisfying assignment, you might still be able to reconstruct a satisfying assignment for that.
Right.
I don't know whether to test whether a formula has a unique satisfying assignment or not.
Sure. I just want to, let's say the promise problem unique SAT. So that's
Yeah,
C.
that's it.
So, but is something, will it also be true that this is a promise that at most 2 satisfying assignment? Is that also?
Possibly. I think you can, because polynomially many you should be able to reconstruct that.
But you have to choose the right subset,
Yeah.
because we can go, etc. Or maybe.
I think it can be managed. That's right.
Oh, it's just.
Up to polynomial numbers, I think can be managed. And maybe I can also mention here that if instead of SAT, disjunctive truth table reduced into sparse, something like P to the NP disjunctive truth table reduced to sparse, then NP will be equal to P. That's because in P to the NP you can find the Lex least satisfying assignment, and all this will apply to the Lex least solution. But let's do the second part. So the open problem is to prove P equals NP terms. Combining the two, we get a funny thing like PH collapses to P to the RP. It should be P equals NP all the time. So let me prove the second result. That is from a paper that I wrote with Johannes Kobler and Martin Mundek 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago. So there the idea is, so we want to, so the idea there is how I can find a sparse set. If SAT disjunctively reduces to a sparse set, then I can find a sparse set that is computable in P to the NP to which SAT will disjunctively reduce via the same reduction. If I can do that, then it's easy to see that PH collapses to P to the NP, because if you take, so we want to prove that sigma 2 P equals P to the NP. So sigma 2 we know as NP to the SAT, and so what we'll do is in P to the NP find, so this NP machine is making, so let's say this NP machine takes an input X, it is making some polynomial size queries to the SAT oracle. Since SAT disjunctively reduces to sparse, we'll show that we can compute a sparse set, a slice of the sparse set in P to the NP, which can be used to answer all the SAT queries that this NP machine will make, so up to some polynomial length. So in P to the NP, I want to compute the sparse set, with which I can answer all the queries that the SAT oracle will make. So suppose I have the sparse set with me okay, maybe I should spell out the details. So SAT is disjunctively reducing the sparse set S. Let's say this NP machine is making queries of length, so the input is X. I am interested in SAT up to length T of length of X. The T is the running time of this NP machine, and that is going to be making queries to S of length from 2 of T of length of X. So my goal is in P to the NP, find, maybe not the entire sparse set, find a sparse set, let's call it S prime up to length 2 of T of length of X, such that this S prime does the job for the same reduction. I basically learned the sparse set through using the reduction, so that this sparse set can be used instead of the original sparse set, and the same reduction will work correctly. Work correctly in the sense that if you give me a formula of size at most T of length of X, I apply the reduction, one of the queries that is listed is going to be in the set S prime if and only if the original formula is satisfied. So once I have the sparse set, I can remove the oracle, right? I'm only left with an NP query, because the sparse set can be used to handle all the SAT queries. That final NP query can be anyway observed by the P to the NP machine. So that is how the thing comes. What I need to explain to you is how do I find the sparse set in P to the NP. So the idea is to find the sparse set in layers, one after the other. In order to, suppose I found the sparse set that will handle all SAT queries of length up to some length n minus 1. I have a set S prime with me. So I can answer all SAT queries up to length n minus 1. And I want to figure out how to deal with SAT queries of length n. Find sparse. So once I find the sparse set which handles SAT queries of length m, I can throw those elements also into the S prime and make sure that they don't mix with each other. So those things can be done by encoding the length of the SAT formula into the sparse set to make sure that things don't mess up. So I've already computed S prime. I want to find the sparse set in P to the NP which will handle queries of length m. How do I do it? So I asked, so let's say I've listed out a bunch of elements, a partially computed set I have, S1 to Si. Now how do I find out if this is already good enough for me to handle SAT at length m? I want to know if for all f in SAT at length m, for all f in 0, 1 to n. So this is all formulas of length m. F is in SAT if and only if my reduction intersect S1 to Si is non-empty. Right. Now, how do I do this? What is this query? This looks like a sigma 2 query to me, because for all f, I need to, in order to check f is in SAT, I need an existential quantifier. This looks like a sigma 2 query. But is it really a sigma 2 query? It's not, because I already have S prime with me which can answer all SAT queries of length up to n minus 1. So how do I check if f is in SAT? I set the first variable to 0, first variable to 1, the formula will shrink. And I can use S prime to check if one of them is satisfied. F is satisfiable if only one of them is satisfied. So this test is in polynomial time, so this entire thing is only a co-NP query. So I can make a query to the NP oracle and I'll know whether S1 to Si is already good enough for me. If not, then I get a counter example in the learning theory kind of framework. That NP oracle says that there exists a formula F. So I start F is in SAT and F of F intersect S1 to Si is n. I can also get the other kind of counter example. There exists a formula F so that F is not satisfiable but it intersects. But I make sure that that part never happens. I will always grow my sparse set safely so that negative counter examples don't happen. We'll see it in this step. So how do I now deal with it? So there is a formula F in SAT. My NP oracle says there is a formula F in SAT so that the queries produced by that formula don't intersect S1 to Si. I prefix search for this formula F. Using the NP oracle, I can actually construct this formula F bit by bit, right? So I construct the first bit. Is there an extension of this which has the same property and so on? In the end, I'll get the formula F. Once I get the formula F, I'll produce this list. I'll have this list F of F. Now, I need to include one of the elements of F of F into my set S1 to Si minus 1. Which one do I include? So let's say F of F is S1 prime to Sn prime. These are the queries that are produced by the reduction. One of these should become my Si plus 1. I can I include anybody into that? So long as a formula and SAT complement is not going to erroneously reduce to the new sparse set, I can include it. So when is the string safe? Si, or let's correct, Sj prime is safe if for all f in SAT complement f, let's call it f dash in SAT complement, f of f dash it does not contain Sj prime. Any such string, if this was not true, then I could not have included Sj prime in my sparse set. But there must exist one such Sj prime, isn't it? Because f is a correct reduction, there must be one of these queries which are not queried by anybody which is not satisfiable. Otherwise, it would not be a disjunctive reduction in the first place. And this is again just an empty query, because testing whether f prime belongs to SAT complement can again be done because I have x prime with me. I can self-reduce the formula, get two smaller formulas. I can check if it belongs to, if they are both unsatisfiable or not by using the reduction that I have to S prime. So this is again just an empty query. So for each of the Si, Sj primes, I check whether it is safe or not using an empty query, and I'll find one which is really safe, and that one I include in my sparse. And clearly, I'm only growing the list of strings S1 to Si all from the original sparse. No, I shouldn't do that. So in order to ensure that the algorithm halts in polynomial time, there may be some strings which are outside the original sparse set which are safe and which I include. But in order to make sure that I stop in polynomially many steps, throw away all the unsafe ones and include everybody which is safe. One of them is surely from the original sparse set, and therefore my algorithm will stop in polynomial time. Because I'm already including a new element from the sparse set, and the sparse set size is bounded by q of p of length of x, and therefore the entire algorithm is running time. The number of queries is being to that. So that concludes the second part. I am doing well with time, I think. So we're done with this. And now comes the third part. The third one is, it's the same thing in the learning theory kind of flavor. It uses a very nice result of long distance. Are there any questions at this point? They're roughly halfway.
Can you explain the last point again? Why does this algorithm equation polynomial? What's the last thing?
So all the Sj primes that I'm not including are surely not in the sparse set. Otherwise, they could not have been queried by an unsatisfiable formula. But I know that f is satisfiable because that was my complex number. So I know this contains an element of the sparse set. But if I include some arbitrary one, I don't know whether the entire algorithm will terminate in polynomial time. I include everybody which is safe, because that will surely include somebody from a new element from the sparse set. So my set is always growing inside the sparse set strictly, and therefore we will stop in polynomial. Okay. So the third result is, it really comes from a learning theory algorithm. This is the BCGKT algorithm. Bishauti tree, Gavarda, Kanun, Tamaki. The name is right. So what it says is that, so I should introduce Anglo's learning model quickly. exactly on the model. So you have an object that you want to learn. Think that it's a Boolean formula or a Boolean circuit. And what you can do is, so what do you mean by learning that object? You can make queries to that object. The two kinds of queries you can make are membership queries. So the target is a Boolean function. Let's say 0, 1 to the end of 0, 1. But what you know is that the target f has a small circuit, small formula or circuit. So depending on what the representation of the Boolean function is, it will be easily or not so easily learnable. Small circuit or formula. Membership queries is that you want to, the query that you will make is f of a equal to 1 or more. So then you know that a bar is something that evaluates to 1. And then you can also make equivalence queries. So equivalence query is something of this kind. You want to know, you ask, there's a hypothetical nature you ask of the teacher, is the formula that I have constructed, is the circuit that I have constructed so far, is it the right circuit? And that is an equivalence query. And the response is a counter example. Either yes, in which case you stop because you found you have exactly learned the target concept. So such things are called concepts. And if you have not managed to learn it, there is a counterexample. A counterexample is something like this formula f, for which the sparse set that you had learned was not good enough. So here a counterexample would be so an equivalence query is that you have a hypothesis circuit. So this is hypothesis circuit. And a counterexample would be a point B in 0, 1 to the end, such that the hypothesis circuit is different from the target. Let's say this is C. And the goal is to give a learning algorithm that runs in polynomial time, that runs efficiently. So this is a kind of a generalization of the path learning model. I won't go into the details. So let's just quickly describe the result from the BC-GKT paper. It's a very nice result. What it says is that poly-side circuits, or circuits I should say, but it's not exactly in the learning theory language, it's half in the kind of framework that in which I want to apply it. So let's say poly-side circuits can be learned, exactly learned, and ZKT with equivalence. And I'll give you a brief description of the algorithm. Once you see the description of the algorithm, can you tell me how you will use it? Yes.
Just a basic question, what were equivalence queries?
Equivalence, so you produce a hypothesis, you get counterexamples, you make membership queries, and then you put together a circuit, and then you ask the teacher whether this is the same as the concept. If it is, then you stop because you've learned the target concept. Otherwise, you get a counterexample. So if H is not equivalent to C, then you get a counterexample.
And the cost of both the queries is the same?
Yeah, it's 1. So these are like, so you think of the teacher as an oracle to which you are making these queries. So this NP oracle is other than the queries that you make to the teacher. Because this NP oracle you need in order to, the algorithm needs the NP oracle. So it's a very nice idea. And it uses all the things that we've been discussing, including the Weyl-Vazirani graph. So let's say that you found a list, you have a list of queries and counterexamples. So the algorithm, let me take a snapshot of what the algorithm has at any point of time. You have such points, right? So let's say P1, A1. What does it mean? It means that the target circuit C at a point B1 evaluates to A1. I got this counterexample because the hypothesis that I had at that time said that it evaluated to A1 complement and I made it to correct. After some time I get another counterexample. So I have a list of labeled sample points. And then I know that I'm only interested in, let's call the set of circuits that are consistent with these sample points as cons.
Membership points are also there.
This doesn't require membership for this. Yeah, so in this case we don't need membership for this. So I have a list of consistent circuits. So these are circuit C such that C of Pi bar equals Pi bar for I going from 1. What do I know about the consistent circuits, right? So let's say that I know that the target circuit, that's why I said polynomial size circuits. I know that my target circuit is of size some P of n, let's say. Otherwise, everything is fine. If the running time will depend on the size of this target circuit. So let's say it's polynomially bounded. And so all the circuits that I'm interested in, which are consistent with what I've seen so far, are all polynomially bounded. And my target is one of these, I know that. What I know about the set cons is that it's polynomial time recognizable set. For every string C, every circuit C, I can test membership and cons. Because I can evaluate it all at all the BIs and check that I get BIs. So these C's are like NP witnesses to some NP language. Just with a leap of imagination, you can think of these as accepting computation paths for some non-existent input. So given a C, I can tell you whether it's consistent or not. What can I do with Weyl-Vazirani? I can isolate one of them with high probability. I can set it up so that I can isolate any one of them with high probability, with roughly the same probability. The Weyl-Vazirani lemma, if you leave out some silly things like 0 power n, is fairly democratic in what it isolates. So there is a result of Jerram, Vaillant and Vazirani. It says that you can almost uniformly sample from the set of solutions to any NP predicate. In particular, from cons, I almost uniformly sample.
I need to know roughly the size of cons to do.
Approximate counting we know can be done in BPP to the NP, and that's part of the story. But that also depends on Weyl-Vazirani. So we can say everything is hidden there. The technical details involve approximate counting and therefore almost uniform sampling. That's right. That's the way the Jerram Weyl-Vazirani proof goes. So we can do all that with Weyl-Vazirani. That's the basic thing with which we can do all that. Now what should we do? Now so suppose magically I can write down the majority of all the circuits and cons. So this is a huge number of circuits. Suppose I could have written down a majority of all the circuits and cons, and suppose by some freakish chance this was also a small circuit, so that it was a valid hypothesis. What will happen if I get a counterexample to the majority? That counterexample is a great counterexample because it kills 50% of the circuits. The cons shrinks by 50%. how do I make this idea work? I can't write down this because it's a huge circuit. And that's where the sampling comes in. Because if I pick a sample, let's call it C1, C2, let's call it P, is a suitably large, it's a polynomial size sample. From bounds. What do I know? I know that from here I can approximately sample, approximately uniformly sample. So I can, let's build repetition samples C1 to Ct and consider the majority of this. And now suppose I am interested in not the standard majority but the 2/3, 1/3 majority. I'm going to get hand wavy at this point because only 10 minutes left. If I only focus on the 2/3, 1/3 majority, a counterexample is going to kill a big fraction of the circuit still to this because it's a random sample. That's simply the BPP probability amplification. You sample, you run the BPP algorithm many times. If it had 2/3, 1/3 kind of behavior, you run it many times, you can push down the error probability to inverse exponential. The same phenomenon happens here, you can check. Majority circuit, a counterexample to this is going to kill a constant fraction of the circuits. And that's the algorithm. Because I will make this my hypothesis. I will sample approximately from forms, which is easily sampleable, produce a suitably large polynomial size sample, which fits with the Chernoff bounds correctly. Because a counterexample goes over 2 power n, I need to make the error probability 1 by 2 to the n square or something like that would be good enough. You can check the details if you. And that is the algorithm, because in the end, and every counterexample is going to kill a constant fraction, and very quickly this algorithm is going to give me the right target. Small caveat, of course, is that this works for circuit, but if you want AC0, you need to do something else, because majority we know is not an AC0 and so on. But you need to approximate majority, and so you can get away with things. But now, can you tell me what the algorithm is to, how do we prove this? It's exactly the same as what we did for the sparse steps. Because if I have learned the circuit that works for inputs up to length n minus 1, I really can solve SAT at length n and polynomial time. Because if you give me a formula, I can self-reduce, I can use the circuit that I've already learned to solve it. And now I only want to learn the circuit at length n. So I can simulate using the NP oracle, I can not only do the sampling and approximate uniform sampling and so on, I can also simulate the teacher and get counterexamples. By exactly the thing that I wrote down. These kinds of things. These kinds of things, the NP oracle can handle them. Are you all okay with this? Then the last, so that completes the proof of SAT NP by Pauli implies P is equal to
So then this give BPP to the NP or?
You get CPP to the NP because you, in the end, you will learn this circuit and you will know that you will learn the circuit because using the NP oracle you would have checked that you have correctly learned it.
Okay.
So on all the other parts you can close them out. I mean you can output them now. Thanks. Okay. So the last one is the last one is almost exactly on the same lines. Also, so 2, 3, and 4 are pretty much on the same lines. I mean, the last one meaning I mean this results, which I'm going to quickly tell you about. First thing is that at start, majority reduces to sparse. So what it means is that the reduction function is going to produce a list of queries such that greater than n by 2 queries are in this. So this is sparse. That's the majority reduction. So there is one thing that you can easily say, that if start majority reduces to sparse, then start polynomial times anyone reduces to linear threshold circuits with just one threshold value. These are weighted linear threshold circuits. So let me explain what this means. What this means is that if you give me a formula here, the reduction is going to produce a list of a Boolean string V1 to, let's say, Vm. And this circuit is described by a hidden set of say integer vector. Such that n is in start if and only L sigma w bar API is greater than 0. So you can go from here to here. You can encode the sparse set. It's a nice exercise to encode the sparse set into a linear threshold function. So now can you guess how we are going to prove that as a consequence Th equals P to the n? So we have to have a learning algorithm for linear threshold circuits. The only difference is that the linear threshold circuit should be, see, one thing that helped us, I should say here, that one thing that helped us here was that I didn't need membership queries, I needed only equivalence queries. If I need membership queries, I am in a bit of trouble. If I want to use a learning algorithm as a plugin to prove a theorem like this, if I have membership queries, I'm in a bit of trouble because the reduced instances does not cover all possible instances of that concept. Like, for example, the bit strings that this reduction produces is not going to run over all possible n bit strings. So if I had a learning algorithm for threshold circuits with one gate which needed to query arbitrary n bit strings for membership queries, it's not going to work because I don't need them really for the reduction to work correctly. But it turns out that this is also learnable with equivalence queries. And it is simply by the ellipsoidal algorithm because so if you have a hypothesis, so the set of all good WIs forms a polytope determined by linear constraints of this form, all the PIs. So if I start at some hypothesis, the counterexample that I get will be like a separation inequality. So it's like trying to find a feasible point inside a polytope with a weak separation orbital. Okay? And the way the ellipsoid algorithm works is that it chooses the next point as roughly the center of the ellipsoid which is contained inside the polytope, so that the separation oracle will kill half the ellipsoid. So the thing will again shrink very rapidly. So without going into the details. So here this was a different way of this majority thing was a different way of killing half the candidate concepts with every counterexample. And there the ellipsoid algorithm can be more or less directly used to do the same thing. And that comes to, I finish my talk with that. More or less like a tutorial.